Last week we started a brand new series called Breathing Room, and if you missed that, you can watch any of our messages anytime on our website or on our Facebook, which also live streams this service. Now, how many of you have a closet at home, a garage, a basement that looks like that? And you're okay with it? Let me see your hands. Yeah, okay, you're a little shy, but there's a handful of you. Now, how many of you are like me, and the next picture will help you relax a little bit? Now you can, because you weren't able to focus on anything else that was going on because you wanted to fix that. That's the same closet, by the way. In this series, I don't really mind if your closet looks like the picture before. I just don't want your life to look like that. I don't want your schedule to look like that. I don't want your relationships to look like that. I don't want your finances to look like that, where there's no room for error. There's no room to fit anything else in there. We're talking about creating some breathing room. And last week we defined what breathing room is. We said that it's the space between our current pace and our limits. Some of you, your schedules, how full are they? How much you're spending, how full your relationships are, because relationally, financially, and with our time, we all have limits. And if there's no space between the limits and the pace of your life, then there are going to be problems. You don't have breathing room, and there's going to be more stress and more anxiety. You're going to focus on one thing and neglect on all other important things, and consequently, our relationships will suffer. Mom, you're always on the phone. Dad, you're always working. You guys always argue about money. You're never here. Where there's no breathing room, our relationships always take a hit. Now, I think regardless of we're okay with a little clutter in our closet or not, I think we would all agree that life is better with a little breathing room. Would you agree with me? To have a little bit of margin, a little space. And here's the cool thing, and you may not be a church person or a religious person, but you believe it or not, God speaks to this very issue. See, when God had the opportunity to create his very own society, built around him, built around his laws, he created a brand new nation called Israel from a group of former Egyptian slaves. And to guide them, God gave them his laws for them. Now you might be familiar with the most famous ones, that what we call the top 10, the 10 commandments. But in these top 10 rules, one of the rules was God commanded his people to take a day off. Now, who wouldn't love a God who commands his people to take a day off? If your boss called you today before the Chiefs game and said, don't bother coming in tomorrow, take the day, how many of you would love your boss, right? And the Chiefs are going to win and go 2-0. It's going to be a beautiful day, right? So from the very beginning, God wanted breathing room for his people because he knows that we need it, and he knows that we function best when we have it. So when the sun would go down on Friday evening, they were to lay down all their tools. They couldn't pick any more grain or fruit or olives. All work had to stop for 24 hours. It was the law. So today I want to kind of talk about breathing room in our time and in our schedules, because maybe you're like me, and I struggle with this. This series is, God has a funny sense of humor because He's putting me through the ringer because I do this, maybe you do this. Is your inclination to cram everything in and take nothing out? To just put more in and add more in and add more in? I can do that. I can say yes to that. And if you're like me and you're living at the limit of your limit, then you're not enjoying your life. And here's how you know if you've got a problem in this area. Here's the things that I've said to myself. Maybe you've said them. I might be a few minutes late. Come on, right? Or I have to leave a few minutes early so I can make sure I can get to my next. Okay, sweetheart, you have a recital, and I know it starts at this time. Now, what number are you in the recital? So I can make sure I don't have to see all the other kids, but I can get there right on time to see you, and then move on to my next agenda item. I mean, I'm at home, maybe you're like me, and I'm thinking about work. Like I need to be working, or I'm at work, and I really should be home, and I'm thinking about being home, and I should be home. How many of you deal with this? This is all of us, I think, on some level, and I think we all want to do better at this. But we're going to talk about how to slow down and create some breathing room instead of cramming more stuff into our life. And I think we all want to do better at this, but how do we do that? So we're going to talk about a very simple application, a very simple idea today. And even if you're not a church person, I know this sounds like preacher talk. We always over-promise things. But this isn't preacher talk because this really does have the potential to change your life because it has the potential to change your time. And I don't know if you know this or not, if you realize this or not, but your time is your life. And as your schedule goes, so goes your life. And we're going to get this big pearl of wisdom from none other than Moses, the same man God used to deliver Israel from slavery and start this brand new nation. We're going to be in Psalm chapter 90, and you might be familiar with the book of Psalms, you might not be, but David wrote a lot of them. You might think of David, but Moses wrote some of them as well. And let me tell you why we should pay attention to what Moses says about time. Because Moses lived to be 120 years old. How many think he's got a little perspective, a little wisdom to share? And you know, what you may not know about Moses is he had really 4 parts to his life. And this is why you should take him seriously, because he's experienced the ups and the downs. He's been through more than any of us would ever go through. In part 1 of his life, Moses was raised in Pharaoh's household. He was an adopted son. He was an Israelite, but he was raised by an Egyptian woman. So the first chapter of his life, everything is going his way. He's got the best of the best. He lives in a palace. He can eat whatever he wants. He's got the best technology. Life could not be any better for Moses. And then in part 2, Moses has a falling out with Pharaoh's family. He murders an Egyptian, so they throw him out of their house, and Moses runs for his life far away from Egypt, and he spends the next 40 years of his life as a shepherd in the backside of the desert. Now, you might have slow days at work, but Moses had really slow days at work. Take the sheep out, sit on a rock, watch the sun go across the sky, and then in the evening, round the sheep back up, take them back to the pen, and do it all over again tomorrow, and for 40 years. This was Moses' life. And you need to understand that Moses didn't know his story. He didn't, like we get, to read ahead and know what's going to happen to him. He had to live this out. He didn't know what was going to happen. He was already 40 years old when he left Egypt. He spends another 40 years in the desert. And now he's an 80-year-old man. And all of a sudden, Moses is probably thinking, this is it. This is all that my life will be. This is as good as it's going to get. He had no idea what was about to happen next. And then in the third part of his life, God appears to him and sends him back to Egypt. And now Moses finds himself at the epicenter of a showdown with the most powerful man in the world in one of the biggest events in human history. And though he's got some insecurities and some doubts, he becomes God's mouthpiece as he stares down Pharaoh and demands, "Let my people go." And he becomes, after 10 crippling plagues devastate Egypt, he becomes the instrument that God uses to deliver God's people out of slavery. And if you read the story, you really need to read the Bible. It's an incredible story. Moses is an incredible person. And the next thing that you know, the next thing Moses knows is in the fourth part of his life, he's the leader of this brand new nation, Israel. And he's leading them, only God knows where, because literally nobody knows where God's taking them. But God knows, and they're following this pillar of cloud and pillar of fire by night. And as they're going toward what's called the promised land, the nation that God was going to give them, the people start complaining and murmuring and arguing, and they're not happy, and they're bitter, and they want to go back. They're not trusting God, and eventually God just says, okay, I'm sick of them. I'm sick of this. I'm not going to let them go into the promised land. Their kids will be able to go, but these people, these adults, Moses, for the rest of your life, your job will be to lead them in circles in the desert until they all die. That's just awesome, right? You want that job description? He must have thought, so I'm raised in Pharaoh's house, and then I'm a shepherd on the backside of the desert, and then I'm mixed into one of the greatest events ever in human history, going toe-to-toe with Pharaoh, and now I'm a tour guide, leading people around in circles in the desert until they die. And then if that wasn't bad enough, at the end of his life, the scriptures say that Moses got to the edge of the promised land, and he's got now all the kids of those who came out of Egypt, and they're ready to go into the promised land, and God says, whoa, Moses, you can't go. but I'm Moses. What do you mean I can't go? And God's like, you can't go in, but I'll let you go up to the top of a mountain, and I'll let you look into the promised land. Now, Moses has some perspective on time. He's got some perspective on life. He's been here and he's been here. And in the 90th Psalm, he shares this perspective with us. And I want it to be our perspective as well, because if we just walk with this filter in our life as it relates to our time, it's going to help you, even if you're not a church person, make better decisions with what you put in, what you take out, and what you spend your time on. And if you are a church person, you do believe in Jesus, listen, you don't have a choice because you believe God has a plan for your life, then you've got to recognize that your life is your time and God has a plan for your time. So let me read these verses for you and kind of unpack it because it's ancient literature and sometimes it's a little bit tricky. But Moses says, Lord, you have been our dwelling place throughout all generations. And he's talking about the nation of Israel, the descendants of Abraham. Throughout all the generations after Abraham, you've been the context of our existence. You're the reason why we're here. He's been their dwelling place, their refuge, their safe place. Moses says, before the mountains were born, and I love the imagery of that, or you brought forth the whole world from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. I love that verse. He says, God, you are everlasting to everlasting. The arrows of your existence point in both directions eternally. And somewhere in the middle, between the bookends of everlasting and everlasting, there's little itty bitty me, Moses. And then there's us, nation of Israel. And then he makes this incredible statement. He says, you turn people back to dust, saying, return to dust, you mortals. Now, this is like the greatest Gandalf moment. If you're a fan of Lord of the Rings, right? Thou shalt not pass, you shall not pass. Return to dust, you mortals, right? That's what I think of. The inner, kid comes out in me. Now, that's not what is going on here, and this might sound harsh to us, but it wasn't to Moses or to the ancient Israelites. He's not saying God is the one behind how or why people die. God is not responsible for the death or the killing of people. That's not what he's saying. He's saying only God knows the beginning and the end. And only God knows how long we get, how many days we get. God controls and knows the number of days of our lives. And now for most of you, whether you recognize it or not, or you can explain it or not, even if you're not a church person, you probably agree that God has something to do with your time, the length of your life. And I can prove it to you, because if you found out tomorrow that you had a terminal disease, would you pray? Or if you found out that someone that you loved tomorrow found out that they had a terminal disease, would you pray? And regardless of whether or not you've prayed in a while, would you pray? And if you would pray, then there's something inside of you that believes that God has something to do with the length and the number of our days. And Moses says, listen, 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by, or like a watch in the night. And the typical watch, the night watch, was a few hours. So this is Moses' way of saying, wow, the years are flying by. Can you relate? The years are flying by. As I get older, they just seem to fly by even faster. I mean, guys, it's September 15th already. Crazy, right? But God, you're God. You're everlasting to everlasting. So if the last 10 years of my life have flown by, then for you, God, 1,000 years must be like 3 hours. Like a watch in the night. God, if you're from everlasting to everlasting, then how must my life, that's so big to me, look to you? He says, yet you sweep people away in the sleep of death. He's talking about you now and me. We're like the new grass of the morning. In the morning, it just springs up. Our life appears, and then by the end of the day, by evening, it's dry and it's withered. Moses is like, God, I guess from your perspective, our long years. In a minute, he'll say, some get 70, some get 80. Moses got 120. I guess from your perspective, our entire lives that we get so worried about and so focused about, it's just like grass that pops up in the morning and is dead by the evening. He continues and he says, our days may come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures, yet the best of them, meaning our years, the best of our years, they are but trouble and sorrow. And we could all probably relate to that. We could all probably say, I've had my fair share of trouble and sorrow, Jason. And Moses would be like, well, let me tell you my story. 40 years in Pharaoh's palace. And then 40 more years keeping sheep, thinking that that's it. And then things begin to pick back up for me, and I'm back in Egypt, demanding Pharaoh would let my people go. And then he does. And 40 years I'm wandering in the desert with complaining people every single day. And I get to the edge, the very edge of the promised land, and I don't get to go. Now, what was your story of trouble and sorrow again? Never mind, Moses, I think your story wins. That's like the worst I've ever heard. And maybe you wonder, how could we believe in a good God if life has so much trouble or sorrow? And Moses would say, no. Don't lose faith simply because you're dwarfed by the magnitude of everlasting to everlasting, and you're confronted with the brevity of your own life. Look at this. He says, for they, meaning the years of our life, for they quickly pass and they fly away. You ever sing that song before, growing up in church? I'll fly away. You were quoting Moses and you didn't even know it. And his point is simple, that time and life just pass so quickly. And the older we get, don't we realize how fast it goes? And if we only knew, he says, if we only knew or could comprehend the power of your anger, your wrath, we'd see that your wrath is as great as the fear that is your due. And that's a hard sentence to translate from Hebrew into English. It sounds like there's a few different ideas put into one broken sentence, but here's what he's trying to say. Moses pauses in this incredible explanation. God, you're everlasting to everlasting, and my life in the scheme of eternity is this piece of grass that's here in the morning and gone by the evening. And 1,000 years is like 3 hours to you. And so here's what I think he's saying. If we could just see God as he really is, then when it comes to our time and our schedules, he's saying that we would give God the reverence that he's due. If we could just realize how eternal God is, and we'd realize that we only have a tiny, itty-bitty slice of time to do something with our life. And if we would realize it was God who was the one who gave us that life, and he's from everlasting to everlasting, then the rational, logical, correct response to our little itty-bitty slice of time in light of his great everlasting to everlasting would be, let's give him the glory that he's due in the time that he's given us. Let's make this little sliver of time that he's given to us matter for everlasting to everlasting, for eternity. Another way we could say this is that we could just see God as he is and realize that we're accountable to him for the time that he's given to us. If we could see God as he is, we would be more careful, wouldn't we, of the time that we've been given. If we saw God for who he is and realized that he's the one who gave it to us and he's everlasting to everlasting and we're like grass, maybe we would rethink what we choose to do with our day. This gift of limited time that he's given to us. And see, we just don't think like this because we're so busy. We just put more and cram more in. And it takes Moses to wake us up to the reality. Because to us, we think that the context of our life is our life. But Moses says, no, the context of your life is not your life, this little itty-bitty sliver. It's everlasting to everlasting. You are going to spend eternity somewhere. And Moses says, your little bit of time plays into the grand narrative of God's story, everlasting to everlasting. And it's good for us to pause and contemplate the magnitude of God and the brevity of our own existence. And Moses says, it will indirectly and it will directly impact how you choose to spend your time. And so he comes to the application. And this is a great reminder. Moses says, so teach us to number our days. We don't do this naturally. Another way to say this is teach us to live as if our days, in fact, have a precise number. Now, you don't know what number that is. I don't know what number that is, but God does. And most of us, we live as if our life will go on forever, don't we? We spend our time as if we're always going to have our kids. We're always going to have our spouse. We're always going to have our health. We're always going to have our parents. We're always going to have this job. We spend our time as if our time is unlimited, and we know that it's not, but in terms of how we schedule and what we cram in and what we prioritize, we live as if our days are not numbered. And Moses says that's a mistake. You need to learn to number your days because none of us can get around the fact that we indeed have a number of days, and only God knows how many we get. Now, you've done this in other areas before. If you are a woman and you've ever been married, then from the moment you set the date and you knew the wedding day, you knew exactly how many days were until you said, I do. You numbered your days. And, if you ever studied for an exam, which, most of us probably didn't, very few of us probably did, but maybe you're like my wife who got straight A's, and when you knew that you had 2 weeks to study for the exam, Betsy, maybe like you, Betsy, would study for 2 weeks. And how many of you were like me? The night before, maybe the hour before the exam, you looked at your notes. The rest of you who got A's, you numbered your days. Or maybe at work you have a deadline and a project and you've got to get it done by this day. You number your days so that you get the job done on time. And Moses is saying, but what if you lived all of your life that way, even with it regards to your time in every area? Because if you did, it would change everything. Teach us to number our days. And here's the promise. So that, there's something coming, so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. In other words, this is what I think he's saying. Teach us to live as if our days are numbered, because when we do, not only will we have wisdom of what we should put in there, we should have wisdom for what we take out of there and what's the priority of what we do. And if we don't live as if our days are numbered, then we will fill our days with things that we wish we hadn't. And at the end of our life, we will have regret. But when we begin to number our days, we gain wisdom and a perspective on what matters the most. No, I can't spend more time doing that because my time is limited. No. I have to spend less time doing that because my days are numbered. I need to stop doing that because my days are numbered. And so here's kind of a summary statement of everything that Moses is teaching us. He says, remembering that our time is limited provides us with wisdom and perspective to know how to spend our limited time. We only get so much. And I'm the worst at this. This message series is like just challenging me and changing some things in my life. And it's good because if you could get into my house and hear the conversations that are going on, you would hear things like, Jason, you can't add more to our already overloaded schedule. Because I just do. I cram. I think I'm Superman. I can do it all. And eventually it always affects the relationships that matter the most to me. I forget this all the time. Maybe you do too. My kids are 9 and 7, but I remember that it was just like yesterday. They were 1 and 3. Betsy and I have been married for almost 12 years, but it still feels like we just said I do some days. My dad is 77. My mom is 68. And it's so easy for me to think that they're just always going to be around. That my kids are always going to be young, that Betsy and I aren't going to grow older, that my parents won't one day go to heaven. Here's how I'm saying this for me, because this is what God is saying to me. Since my time is limited, I need to limit how I spend my time. And I think maybe you're like me. And in this season of life that you're in, maybe it's similar to the season of life that I'm in. It's very hard to do. Everywhere I look, somebody needs something else from me. The urgent shouts as if it's the most important. I mean, pastoring a church means there's always another meeting to attend, another leader to invest in, another family to get to know and connect to other families, and it just becomes so much in my life. And I'm a full-time husband and a father and a son and a sibling and a friend. And you're just like me. You feel the tension too. We only have so much time. So since our time is limited, we need to limit what we do with our time. And we get it in other areas. We get it when it comes to our money because we know we have this much to spend. Our money is limited, but we forget it when it comes to our time. But listen, our time is more valuable than our money. It's our most valuable asset. It's more valuable than all of what you have in your 401k, all of what you have in your savings and checking account. Our time is precious and it's limited, and at the end of your life, I promise you, you won't want more money, you will want more time. And you know why I know that? Because I'm a pastor, I've been doing it for 20 years, and I've been around the bedsides of people in their last moments, and this is what they always say. I wish I had more time. So before I wrap up today, I'm going to do all of us a huge favor. I'm going to help you. I'm going to fast forward to the end of your life so that we can gain some wisdom and some perspective there that we won't know until that last day. And we're going to pick that up, and we're going to bring it back to our current day today and see if this will help us make some better decisions. Bronnie Ware is a hospice nurse whose job allows her to care for people at the very end of their life, sometimes weeks, sometimes days, sometimes hours. And they're there at their most vulnerable and their most honest moments. And she asked these patients if there were any regrets that they had in their life. And you can go and read her book. She compiled this book and the responses of these people in what's called the top 5 regrets of the dying. It's an incredible, incredible book. The top 5 regrets of the dying. And today, to help kind of fast forward and get a perspective that we won't get until that moment in our life, but let's look at what the dying have said is their greatest regrets. I'm going to give you the top 2, the second one first, and then I'll give you the top one. And the second one is the one we think would be the top one, but it's not. The second regret, the second most regretted thing is that they say that I wish that I hadn't worked so hard. Now, probably nothing surprising there, nothing new there. We would probably all guess that one. We've heard that probably before. She says this. She says, this came from every male patient that I nursed. They missed their children's youth and their partner's companionship. At the end, she said, they all said the same thing. They wish they hadn't worked so much. She went on to say that women also spoke of this regret, but as most were from an older generation, many of the female patients had not been breadwinners. She said, all of the men I nursed deeply regretted spending so much of their lives, check this out, on the treadmill of a work existence. And today, listen, more women work full-time today than ever before, which is incredible. But you know what that means? That means that today we have the potential to have much wider and greater regret than ever before when it comes to how hard we work and how much of life we miss. Because listen, none of us are exceptions to this rule. If we don't learn to number our days, we will misspend our days. And at the end of our life, all of us will have the same avoidable regret. I wish I hadn't worked so much. Because when you think that you have all the time in the world with your kids or with your spouse or with your parents, and then life happens and you suddenly realize you don't anymore have that time, when that happens, you realize you can't go back and do it again. And here's why this is important. Here's why we should listen to this. Because this is what those people who are in their last moments, last hours, this is what they're saying is their second greatest regret. And I think we'll have that same regret if something doesn't change today. Because you can't avoid the fact that there is a number to your days. So let their wisdom come into your life. Let it pass on to you. Now, before I get to the number one regret, if you're a teenager, if you're a college student, or if you've just tuned out, then tune back in because this is so extraordinarily helpful. This is the greatest regret of the dying, and it might surprise you. Number one, I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life that others expected of me. Here's what she said. She said, this was the most common response and regret of all. When people realize that their life is almost over and look back clearly on it, it's easy to see how many dreams have gone unfulfilled. She says most people had not honored even a half of their dreams and had to die knowing that it was due to choices they made or didn't make. And this is powerful. Don't miss this. Health brings a freedom very few realize until they no longer have it. Now, I've just done all of us in the room a favor. I've fast-forwarded your life to the very end, and now you have the benefit and the perspective and the wisdom of living as if your days are numbered from those whose days are now done. So what will you do with the wisdom? When you look at your current schedule, when you look at your time, when you look at the pace that you have in your life, what will you do with that when you look at the fact that there's very little space, like in my life, maybe like in your life, here's my limit and here's where I live at. Lord, give us wisdom that comes from knowing that our days are numbered. And I know what your pushback is on this. Before I close, I know, because I'm not different than you. I get to get up here and talk to you, but I'm just like you. I know what's going on in your head. But Jason, if I don't do as much as I possibly can, I'll never make it. What's it? I don't know, but I won't make it. Maybe you'll agree with me. Don't you think that we should probably make sure we're chasing the right it? Because you can spend your whole life chasing it and get to the end of your life and realize it was the wrong it. And let's just be honest. Most of us, if you're like me, you're just too busy to even stop and think about what it is. You're just trying to keep your head above water. You're just trying to tread water here. You can't, you're just doing what you can to make it work. We can't slow down long enough to even consider what it is. But listen, we better know what it is if we're going to pack our lives so full of it and trying to pursue it. But if I don't do as much as I can, I'll fall behind, Jason. I'll fall behind. Who? Fall behind what? Where in our culture have you bought into this lie that says you've got to be like, and this is how it has to be, and I don't want my kids to fall behind, and I don't want to fall behind, and I don't want our marriage to fall behind? Who? Fall behind what? You should have an answer to what that is. If it's going to drive your days and drive your life, listen, you should have an answer to what it is. Fall behind what? So much of our life is comparison, keeping up. The number one regret of the dying is not living the life they know they wanted to live. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we can have wisdom. But if I don't do as much as I possibly can, I'll be poor, Jason. And for some of us, this is a huge driving factor in our lives. But we've never stopped to define what that means. There's this lurking thing. Maybe it's because the way you grew up. Maybe it was the state of your home or the finances, or maybe it echoes in your mind, in the back of your mind, because of the way that your parents raised you or who your parents were. But have you ever thought through what that really is, what's really driving you? Because that's an emotion, and it's usually an emotion of fear that's driving you to do more, because you don't want to be like. It's something in your past unresolved. But I got to keep going, or I'll be... No. Lord, teach us to number our days so that we can have wisdom. But if I don't do all that I can do, I won't be accepted. By who? Listen, teenagers, college students, young adults in the room, your parents have said this to you, but you don't listen to them, so listen to me, because I'm going to tell you something. All the people that are so important to you right now, that are driving your schedule and how you spend your time, you're not even going to know them in 10 years. Every parent in the room, amen? So don't let them rob you of what's most important to you. And I'll tell you what's most important to you. You're going to realize this at some point. It's your time. And you'll never be able to get wasted time back. So number your days so you can have a heart of wisdom. And if I may be so bold, teenagers, listen. Stop trying to be accepted by the people who you won't even know in 10 years. Instead, focus on being with those who love you and who you love and who won't be around in 10 years. Spend time with your grandparents. Spend time with your parents, with your aunts and your uncles, because the day will come where you wish you had more time with them. And if you don't, you'll look back one day with regret. But Jason, if I don't do as much as I possibly can do, I won't measure up. I won't have any value. Because production and busyness means I'm important. Measure up to who? Measure up to what? If you don't know what's driving you, listen, it's possible if you're not careful, you can get to the stage of your life where you don't have any more health, and you don't have any more options, and you don't have any more time, and you have wasted your life doing something that you never even defined. And if you're a Christian, I said this a moment ago, if you're a Christian, if you are a follower of Jesus, and you believe there's a personal God who has a personal plan for your life, do you understand how extraordinarily important this issue of our time is? Because if you believe like I do that God has something that he wants for you, that means then if you're not careful, you can miss all of what God wants for you, and you can allow other things or other people to determine for you what needs to be in your life and not in your life. and what priority it should be given. But if you are a follower of Jesus, number your days, because if you believe God has a plan for your life, that means God has a plan for your time. And he should be the one driving what goes in and what takes out, what you do more of and what you do less of. God has a plan for your life, for your time, for your marriage, for your kids. You've got to number your days, because by doing so, you'll gain insight and wisdom into what God's plan is for you. And if you're not doing that, you're living as if you're in charge of your time. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you've surrendered your life to him, and you've said to Jesus, you're in charge of my life. You're in charge of my time. That's what it means to call him Lord. He's the leader. And listen, if you're here and you're not a church person, then I want you to consider again today, maybe you've never considered it, that God does love you, that God does have a plan for your life. He has a plan for your time. He cares about you, and he cares about how you live your life. So choose to number your days so you may have a heart of wisdom, because God has so much more for you than this. And he wants to show you his goodness and his love and his plan for your life. And it all starts with the decision to trust that Jesus is who he says he is, and he can do what he says he can do. So as I close, if my team would come back up, let me ask you these final questions. Because you're going to number your days, you're going to leave here, and you're going to think about this, ask yourself this: what needs to be added to my schedule? Or maybe who? Maybe you need to put a name there. Who needs to be added to my schedule? Because right now they're not there. And because I'm numbering my days, what needs to be gone? What needs to be subtracted and taken out? Because it's robbing me of my time. It's robbing me of my life. And maybe, again, you need to put a name there. What do I need to do more of? Because I know my days are numbered. I know that these kids won't always be in my house. Maybe it's more time around the dinner table with your family. Maybe it's more time talking with your kids. Maybe it's more time with your friends, your parents. What do I need to do more of? Because these days really are numbered. And what do I need to do less of? It's not bad, but it's just not as important. Maybe it's TV, or it's on your phone, or maybe it's your hobbies, maybe it's golf. And it doesn't mean you need to throw any of those things away. It just needs, because I'm numbering my days, what do I need to do less of? And the reason why this is a life changer is because it's a time changer. And your time is your life. So let's stand together. Let me pray for you. So Lord, teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. Because if our time is limited, then we need to learn how to limit our time. So Lord, help us to do that. Give us wisdom to know what to do with what we've just heard and to put it into practice in our life. And if we're here and we're on the other side of faith, I invite you to consider that Jesus does love you, that he did die on the cross for you, and he did rise from the dead for you. And if you will today choose to believe in him, to trust in him, then a pivot can happen in your life where you begin to learn of the wonderful plan that God has for your life. I invite you to consider that, to accept that Jesus is who he says he is. He can do what he says he can do. It starts with a simple prayer. I believe. Forgive me of my sins. Change my life. If you're here and you are a church person, what needs to be added? What needs to be subtracted? What needs more time in your life? What needs less time in your life? God, give us wisdom to put this into practice. I pray in Jesus' name.